in the Narrative Book, an advanced workshop that focuses on writing long narratives and books of fiction. I tend to categorize writers in different ways depending upon how their writing processes work and the kinds of writing they ultimately produce. And I'm going to ask you to explore these questions this semester to become a bit more self-aware without, I hope, becoming too self-conscious. Ask yourself this: are you a linear writer of linear narratives, a nonlinear writer of linear narratives, a nonlinear writer of nonlinear narratives? Or do you do it all, depending upon what you need to do and when? I've talked about these briefly before, but I'd like to go into a little bit more detail in a bit. These categories are artificial, of course, based on overly simplistic labels, and I intend to explain them in more detail as we go along. But they can help us to begin seeing a relationship between our process, the way that we make things, and our product, the things we make. And these categories can also help us learn how to coordinate what I call generating mind and sequencing mind when we need to, especially for book-length projects. When we say what kinds of writers we are, what feels most right as we write, we can also begin identifying ways of eliminating potential conflicts and blocks between generating mind and sequencing mind. And we can write with greater ease and confidence, especially when we're juggling many different scenes and stories, sometimes simultaneously in and out of sequence. How we write and structure longer narratives has a lot to do with our individual tolerance of uncertainty and ambiguity. But it also has to do with our ability to organize our materials whenever we near forks in our narratives, internal obstacles based upon conflicts within our own identities that we've not yet identified. Our ultimate goal, of course, is to take the chaos of life and give it meaning for ourselves and for our readers, often to find something ugly and painful and make it beautiful. But when we can't make sense of the chaos we've created ourselves, we can become hopelessly stuck. The conflict we've chosen to write about bumps up against our own internal conflicts, and we don't know where to go next. As Andy Dillard writes in The Writing Life, when you are well into the writing and you know what comes next, and yet cannot go on, when every morning for a week or a month you enter your room and turn your back on your work, then the trouble is either of two things. Either the structure has forked so the narrative, or the logic, has developed a hairline fracture that will shortly split it up the middle, or you are approaching a fatal mistake. What you had planned will not do. If you pursue your present course, the book will explode or collapse, and you do not know about it yet, quite. Most writers have been here before, that terrifying moment when we get hopelessly stuck and ask ourselves, now what? Or what have I missed? Should I write something that happens before this moment first, or something yet to come? How can I write about this moment if I don't understand my character enough? Why did my character do this? Is this action and choice in character both surprising and inevitable? How can my character make future choices if I can't understand the choice she's making right here? The difference between writers and those who want to write lies here. Those who write live with the uncertainty of not knowing and know how to allow generating mind and sequencing mind to work together without conflict to solve the problems their narratives create as they write. They live with the problems and solve them rather than walking away. They're persistent. They work on other stuff and allow the unconscious to do its work without interference or pushing too hard. Some writers are particularly good at writing and generating mind, writing full out without inhibition, the joy of their work arising from a spirit of discovery and exploration. They're open to the possibility that they don't know what comes next, and they don't have to know. In fact, they prefer it that way. The joy of writing for such writers is in the not knowing. But when their narrative's coherent sense of cause and effect, or its coherence through images or ideas begins to explode and scatter, such writers experience a terrible sense of writerly despair. And like a child who's good at playing, making big messes, they don't often know how to clean up their rooms, how to organize their materials, the separate parts of their narratives, into a coherent whole. Writers who write with generating mind love first drafts, but often don't want to edit. When the fun part's over, they expect someone else to clean up their messes rather than learning how to clean it up themselves. Some writers are particularly good at sequencing mind, cleaning up the kid's room after the kid's made the big mess, but too often they're pushy and bossy and tell the kid, go on, play, so they'll have something to work on. Writing is different from other arts. We must first create our materials before we can shape them. Writers who organize and edit in sequencing mind hate first drafts, mostly because they can't write them and are always getting in the way, and only work well when there's a mess to clean up. Sequencing mind loves to work on many drafts, playing around with words and sentences and paragraphs and structure, endlessly trying different ways of organizing what the imagination has produced. Put that over there and put this over here, sequencing mind says, especially when it's doing its job well. Instead of shouting, clean up this damn room, sequencing mind says, here, let me help you. And when generating mind and sequencing mind work together, they can play their roles whenever they're needed rather than pushing each other around. Moving easily between these two kinds of thinking, a sense of intuitive play and a logical sense of how to put things together when we feel hopelessly lost, is at the heart of being able to write long narratives, and for that matter, short ones. In many senses, generating mind is about the journey, what we do while we're getting there, and sequencing mind is about the destination, what we do when we arrive. As E.L. Doctorow writes, writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. This kind of openness to the unknown requires individual tolerance of uncertainty and ambiguity and a kind of stubborn patience and fearlessness. Not just a willingness to face the unknown, but to celebrate it as we discover where we're going, even celebrating the terror of going places we've never gone before, and realizing something new about ourselves and where we've gone. Keats calls this openness to and celebration of the unknown a kind of negative capability, when a writer is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The confidence that we'll arrive at our destination, even if it's utterly different from what we've planned, mapped out, or expected, is what we all work for as writers, yet such confidence is rare for far too many writers, mostly because one kind of writing process, generating mind, finding on our own way, and sequencing mind, making maps of our journey so we don't get lost, dominates their personalities and prevents them from making a kind of truce with themselves, finding ways to produce material and shape them when the right time comes. This kind of fear can increase significantly when we make the leap from short to long narratives. If we ask ourselves what kinds of writers we are, and if we assume that generating mind is about the journey and sequencing mind is about the destination, perhaps we should begin by asking another question. What kind of traveler am I? When you take a long trip, do you just take off with a backpack without much planning, simply stick out your thumb at a nearby exit, and wait for the next person who picks you up to determine where your stop is next? Most of us think that kind of traveling, that kind of letting go, is dangerous. But in many ways, courageous writers must do just that every day. Be willing to risk surprise, even danger, to write something fearless, courageous. When you travel, are you a wanderer, adventurer, or a discoverer? Is the journey as important as the destination, or more important than the destination? Can you say, I'm going to Las Vegas, but I'll be perfectly happy if I end up in Seattle or Fairbanks, Alaska? Are you the kind of traveler who stops at every interesting exit to see the petrified forest or the painted desert or the Grand Canyon or the thing? If you are, you'll probably travel as most writers do, alone. Or do you map out everything and schedule every stop, stopping in Motel 6 on Thursday at 6 p.m. and Motel 6 by Friday so you can be in Vegas by Saturday at 6 p.m.? Not much of a gambler, are you? I used to be terrified of long-distance travel, worried that my crappy car might break down in Death Valley. It never did, but the worry and the fear kept me from traveling far, far too long. I still have a crappy car, but now I take my time. My map is flexible. I'm a member of the AAA. A destination-only planning is planning from fear, not from courage based upon taking important risks. And as writers, we must be willing to take risks. Whether you see writing a long book project as a journey or not, no matter what others might tell you in writing workshops, writing isn't a race or a competitive sport. Bestsellers aren't necessarily the best books out there, and the truly great books may not sell very much. The difference is that one kind of book lasts and the other doesn't. If our books last, guess what? We've won. Even if we've died penniless. Okay, that's a little depressing. For some writers, writing is a competitive sport, and we have to learn to live with those for whom winning is everything. The rest of us can write simply because it's what we want to do, what we have to do. The rest of us can let go of our need to compare our expressions with others simply because we all write differently. If we're tortoises in their hairs, we remember that we'll get there eventually, dope-de-dope, enjoying the scenery along the way, and maybe even win a prize anyway because we took our time to discover something we didn't know. Ultimately, though, we don't have to win. And if we're Salieri's to other writers' Mozarts, so be it. A little envy doesn't hurt so long as we don't dwell on it or let it affect our work. The work is everything. But let's just say writing is a kind of race. What kind of writer are you? A sprinter or a marathon runner? A short story writer or a novelist? Or do you do a little bit of both? We all know the loneliness of the long-distance runner, even if we're mostly writing stories one after the other that we hope to make part of a larger book of stories. To help us discover what kinds of writers we are, or want to be, one important question we can ask ourselves is this: how do we choose what to write next, especially in long narratives? Is it to find out what happens next, or what a character's next choice will be step by step? If so, we're probably linear writers interested in plot and character development in mostly traditional linear chronological order, traditional dramatic structure. Or is it to find out the unknown and perhaps unknowable questions that haunt us, our obsessions, which determine what to write next? If so, we're probably nonlinear writers who write our stories in the order of how compelling they are to us one day to the next. And exploring questions in our stories leads us to other questions and other stories and other questions, all leading to the ultimate question: why? Why do people do the things they do? What, as actors are always saying, are my characters' motivations? Like many writers, I tend to do a little bit of both, but I've realized I'm mostly a nonlinear writer who writes linear stories, writing stories as they compel me, driven by obsession, often obsession I don't and probably will never fully understand. When I write what obsesses me, I tend to write better stories, but I also tend to write them out of order. I'm not really sure why. The trouble is how to write what I have to write next and still keep track of some kind of coherent structure, linear or nonlinear. In other words, I've always struggled with sequencing mind, how to organize my stories in a linear or nonlinear way that's most clear, compelling, and organic to the story I'm trying to tell. In many ways, linear and chronological have kept me stuck in time. Realizing that I mostly write in a nonlinear way. It has taken me over 30 years of hating my writing process when I could have been accepting it and writing more, constantly wishing I wrote as others did, with more ease, with fewer blocks. If the students I've taught over the last 30 years are any indication, though, I suspect I'm not the only one with this kind of struggle. In fact, I'd say my students struggle with their writing processes at least as much as I have, or more. And many more are nonlinear writers than they or I could have ever suspected. Especially students who write long projects, who write with the kind of depth of thought and feeling that makes their writing unforgettable. Like Billy Pilgrim in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, intuitive, nonlinear writers are often already unstuck from time, and they simply write what they want to write, have to write, next. Of course, writing from obsession, allowing obsession to be a part of what we decide to write next, is risky, even dangerous, demanding a great deal of self-awareness and courage and the willingness to be unstuck from our narrative's timeline and linearity. And if we fail, especially when we write, motivated by vengeance rather than by curiosity, understanding, and even forgiveness, we can end up like Ahab tied to the great white whale that bit his leg off. And many writers have perished, drinking too much or committing suicide, driven by such obsessions. Not such a good idea. Still, I'd argue that the best place to write from is from obsession, the fire that burns most brightly in our bellies, as long as we have enough distance to see ourselves and our stories with some clarity, and the willingness to unmask ourselves and our characters. As Gustave Flaubert, the father of the modern novel, writes, "Be regular and orderly in your life like a bourgeois, so that you may be original and violent in your work." I don't think Flaubert is advocating violence here. I'm certainly not. For me, he's saying that it's difficult to write drama when you're smack in the middle of it. That it's possible to write drama while you're being a drama queen, but it has its costs. William Wordsworth refers to this ability in his lyrical ballads as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, great emotion recollected in tranquility. Being able to move back and forth between the part and the whole, from the forest and the trees, from the story or chapter and an entire book, makes just this kind of clarity and calm awareness more possible. For better or for worse, our obsessions choose us, and not the other way around. But writing is a way of confronting those obsessions directly, revealing them organically through our stories without necessarily having to enact them through the drama in our everyday lives. Writing from obsession, or what most compels us to write, demands more from writers than simply writing what happens and then what happens next. And its main advantage over writing in a linear way may also become its main disadvantage. It requires greater consciousness of our unconscious motivations and a greater growing awareness of what our obsessions might be, without crippling self-consciousness or self-judgment. It requires that we become less interested in what happens than in how and why, discovering what happens by understanding deep characterization as we write, why human beings do the things they do, those who choose to create and those who choose to destroy, those who choose generosity over selfishness, kindness over cruelty. In many ways, we must also be willing, like Billy Pilgrim in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, to become unstuck in time. Theologians and astrophysicists seem to agree on two things: that the universe arose from a single moment of seeming nothingness, ex nihilo, and that time is an illusion we're all stuck in. So perhaps we have to let go of the illusion of time, sometimes just to get unstuck in our work. being flexible about when to sequence and organize and edit our writing as timekeepers and craftswomen and men, and when to let the writing flow, following its own deep instinctive urgings, understanding that we don't know everything yet, and we don't have to, and we probably won't until we've finished the last draft, and even then we will probably never know. The best fiction, Chekhov suggests, is less about answering questions than in asking the right ones. I've seen it happen again and again and in student stories. If they plan too much and get stuck with the question, now what happens, not knowing where to go next, they often fall into familiar plot tracks and tricks we've seen in 1,000 popular movies and books. To be original writers, we must move beyond the predictable, the kind of storytelling that never really moves beyond plot and surface action. Despite what we might assume given Hollywood's obsession with fight scenes and lightsabers and automatic weapons, fire and explosions, action and action sequences have very little to do with drama at all. Sometimes the greatest drama occurs when the adversaries are unarmed. Rather than being imitators of popular culture, then we must know when and how to be true to our own vision and voices, our own authentic obsessions and questions, simply to become ourselves more original, more authentic as human beings, because we've tried to deepen ourselves and our stories as we've written. That doesn't mean we have to be deep in the negative sense of the word. Oh my God, do you have to be so damn deep? But in the sense that we're always looking beneath the surface, behind the mask, and showing readers what we see unflinchingly. To become unstuck in narrative time and linearity, we must often ask questions about when, how, and why we write, and revise as we do, and be willing to change or to accept our process, adapting to and deepening our understanding of that process rather than hating it and giving up, trying endlessly to change it and too often failing, hating ourselves, our writing process, and our writing even more. When I taught in the MFA program at the University of Alabama, I once attended a terrific lecture by my former colleague, novelist, short story writer, and nonfiction writer John Keeble, who just written the definitive book on the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. When we ask ourselves, how do I write, Keeble told his audience, it helps to see how others write. While I've made a few changes in the following sketches to those he drew on the chalkboard that day, the following images and ideas are directly from Keeble's lecture, a lecture that changed the way I write and see writing. Do you write from beginning to end without revision? Beginning at yesterday's previous work, then pushing forward? Returning to the beginning to revise only after you've finished a first draft? This technique has many advantages, especially say for short stories, keeping the flow of words, freeing the unconscious to perform its miracles without interference from sequencing mind. Our meddlesome internal editor and those negative voices that tell us we're off track and aren't any good. My friend, novelist, and nonfiction writer Valerie Miner once described her writing process as a variation on the write the entire first draft method. She writes a draft of an entire book, longhand, in a yellow legal pad, moving ahead until she's completed the entire novel. Then she types in the entire manuscript into her computer, prints it up, and then deletes the file she just typed. Yes, she deletes the file. A holdover of the days when she wrote on a typewriter, then threw the first draft away so she wouldn't be tied to first draft mind. After printing, she marks the manuscript up and types it into her computer again, following the same pattern until she's written 11 drafts. 11? I asked her. Exactly 11, she said. That's just the way I write. I like feeling the words flow through my fingers again, changing and accumulating rhythm and depth until I get it right. This write the entire first draft technique has significant disadvantages too. Sometimes you can write a lot of words but end up abandoning them when you realize they weren't what you intended or wanted. Slaying our darlings, as Faulkner wrote, is essential to writing and revision. And sometimes we have to write many words before we realize we have to write many more words, and maybe even start over. Once, for example, when I was a fellow at the MacDowell Colony in the 90s, I spent 2 months writing 6 linear chapters of a novel in progress. The muse had stopped visiting me much as I wrote, more and more, with greater and greater frustration as I tried to keep my linear chronological forward momentum. Then the muse disappeared, and I found myself writing from sheer will alone. One morning toward the end of my stay, instead of the muse appearing behind me, a little writer's block demon did. "You made a wrong turn back in chapter 1, he whispered into my ear, and in that moment I realized that the 2 months I'd written Shirley by Will alone, 2 months I had written by Shirley by Will alone, were wasted. I'd pushed too hard in a linear story, and my heart wasn't in it anymore. Years later, I salvaged parts of those chapters I'd abandoned, so the 2 months weren't completely lost, but I didn't know that then. I felt a kind of despair I've never felt before, especially since I was on the tenure track, feeling the pressure of others' expectations. At the end of my stay, I sat down and wrote a short story in the last 2 weeks, the title story of an award-winning collection. But I also understood that writing chronologically, linearly, wasn't working for me most of the time. It was a hard lesson I'm grateful for now. Writing without revision is fine for many writers. Their main goal to write a certain number of words a day and to keep going. But when they run into blocks, they often find themselves stuck for long periods of time without being able to move forward. I've learned the hard way that I simply can't write like this in a linear chronological way, especially when I'm writing book projects. And when I've tried, I've encountered blocks that impede my forward momentum, my flow of words, sometimes for days, weeks, or even years, as I wait for the sudden insight to come that moves me beyond the block. I wouldn't wish my writing process on anyone, but I suspect I'm not the only writer who gets blocked this way. So, to return to the questions. If you have trouble writing without revision, do you revise as you write, reading over and editing the previous day's work, then moving on to new material? I tend to write this way, especially when I'm writing a linear story or chapter. But mostly, I'm a non-linear writer of mostly linear stories, as I've said, stories I sequence sometimes long after I've written them, and finding myself unable to write with a strict cause and effect momentum from one episode to the next, I've had to adapt to find out just exactly how I write and why, and how I can accept that process and move on without frustration, in a real sense making peace with it so I can be more productive. This revise as you write technique is fine for some writers, but many avoid it simply because they get stuck more often when they have to. They don't trust the editor to play his role without being a bit of a bully. And that instinct is a good one to have, especially if we've grown up with abusive authority from the past, negative voices that stay with us and say, we and our work are no good. Usually when I write a project, it's well crafted when I get to the end, but it takes me a long time to get there. And if I get stuck too often, I'm impatient, especially when I've waited a long time for an answer to the technical problem or unresolved personal issue I've encountered. Too many times, wanting to move on, I've gotten stuck in a cycle of obsessive revision, completely revising the life out of a story unless and until I stop and move on to something else, allowing the answer to come from the unconscious in its own fiercely patient time. Writing each scene again and again until I've abandoned cliches and easy dramatic moves, making me believe each scene before I move on, is tedious and slow. But in the long term, I have to revise less when I'm finished. It's a big trade-off, but one I'm willing to live with so long as I'm not just being a perfectionist. When I reach those moments when I get stuck in a project and need to give the unconscious time to come up with an answer to my unresolved questions, solutions to a story's technical problems, rather than waiting around, I simply shift to another project. or different parts of the same project, allowing myself the freedom to keep my forward momentum until the unconscious delivers the key to the giant steel door blocking my way. Ultimately, we must be willing to live with the ambiguity of not knowing everything, sometimes not even anything yet, and we must be willing to admit to ourselves when we've planned too much and lost the mystery, the fire in the belly that made us want to write from the beginning. To put it another way, over the last 30 years and more, my writing process has become a little like working in a room full of toasters. Before I used to stand around waiting by a toaster for the toast to pop up, a little like waiting for a pot of water to come to a boil. But I see my job now as simply showing up every day and feeding slices into the toasters all around me where they can cook in the unconscious a while, and when something pops up, go over and butter it. Put a little jam on too. Writing when the best answer from the unconscious finally comes. All right, it's a silly metaphor. The disadvantage of such an approach is that if I have too many projects going, I worry that I'll never finish anything, especially if those projects are parts of different books. For this reason, I've learned to focus on one book project at a time in recent years, shifting from stuckness in chapters or stories to other chapters or stories within that project to keep my forward momentum. The point is to keep moving. A little bit like a shark who has to keep moving to stay alive. I've discovered that leaving one chapter or story when I get stuck and working on another actually helps me get blocked much less without feeling stymied by a writing process I wouldn't wish on anyone. My main goal is describing how I work is to generate ideas and perhaps help you discover your own process by talking some about mine. I'm not asking you to write like me, but to discover how you write and write like that. Each of the methods I've discussed here, writing single projects from beginning to end without editing single projects as we write, and switching back and forth between projects as we write to allow the unconscious to do its work, can be risky. But many writers will tell you that they use most of these methods when they need to. Having that kind of flexibility can help generating mind and sequencing mind do their jobs when they're needed, sometimes even simultaneously. The trick is to discover the way we write and then to write that way in the most efficient ways we can, discovering our writing process and our stories as we write. Sometimes our tendency to get blocked comes less from technical problems we've encountered or personal conflicts we have yet to resolve than from conflicts built into our brain's biology, representing two completely different ways of thinking, generating mind and sequencing mind, or as Gabrielle Lucerico calls them in her groundbreaking 1983 book, Writing the Natural Way, sign mind and design mind. One method of thinking isn't better than the other, just different, Rico suggests, and the split between these two worldviews, between the logical left brain world and the intuitive right brain world, may be the source of many conflicts within and between people. And these conflicts show themselves every day as we write. Most of us have seen variations of this diagram before in our writing classes, however inaccurate it may be 30 years later. And in many ways, the diagram is too simplistic, especially since brain biology has made geometric leaps in identifying parts of the brain associated with speech, emotion, and logic that don't fit into these neat little diagrams. Still, I like to think of this diagram as an excellent metaphor for the implicit conflicts between two ways of thinking. Most of us have brain hemispheres that are dominant, left or right. I'm left-handed and I started out as an artist, so I'm mostly right-brained except when I'm editing. And part of learning how to write is about finding a balance between the two, not allowing one hemisphere to dominate the other, the corpus callosum between both hemispheres being something of a peace negotiator. If one is a bit lopsided, the task becomes finding ways to train the non-dominant hemisphere, in my case moving from painting to writing. Some see these two principles as feminine and masculine, represented by the yin and the yang. And if our patriarchal culture tells us anything, we value logic over intuition almost every time. The left hemisphere, or sign mind, Rico writes, processes things one at a time to the rational intellect sequentially. A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, focusing on details and parts rather than wholes, the trees rather than the forest, and it tends to split the world into categories, producing linear thinking. Because it also tends to draw on fixed codes, rules, and laws rather than those created by personal conviction or conscience, some might think of it as rigid and closed-minded to other ways of seeing the world, but that too may be a bit too simplistic. Having the power of syntax, writing being a task that requires writing one word at a time, one after the other, and following the rules of grammar, Rico writes, the left brain talks and talks and talks, a little bit like I am right now. The right hemisphere, or design mind, on the other hand, processes everything at once. One could say that Einstein conceived the theory of relativity visually, intuitively, in a flash of insight from the right hemisphere, as he rode on a train, imagining it speeding through the universe at the speed of light. Then, using his left hemisphere, he spent much of his young adult life trying to prove that fact. While the left hemisphere focuses mostly on quantifying, the right hemisphere focuses on qualitative ways of thinking, connecting the world into related wholes rather than dividing them into parts. Because it focuses on wholes, design mind is often visual, seeing an entire face and recognizing it immediately, even if we haven't seen someone for many years. Some might argue that the right hemisphere is also a source of what we might call emotional intelligence, the ability to imagine how others feel and to find empathetic connections, to imagine characters who don't exist and to make them seem real and authentic. While the left hemisphere might write a sentence like, "A woman is a female human being," the right hemisphere might move immediately toward the lyrical, as John Updike writes, "Wide, warm woman, white-thighed, wooed and wed, wife." In many ways, the left and right hemispheres represent not just different kinds of truth, but different truths altogether. And though both of them are valid, either qualitatively or quantitatively, many left brain types argue that analytical truth is somehow more true, say, than literature. After all, literature is based on lies, as a high school math teacher told me once. Lies in service of a larger truth, I would have said if I were older and smarter then, and had thought about it long enough. But he had a paddle propped under his desk, and he was a rules keeper, left-brained all the way. Another time when I first started college, I had an inspiring, brilliant anthropology teacher named Dan Archer, a Marine Reserve pilot whose helicopter crashed in the Gulf of Mexico during a hurricane, not long after I took his class. During coffee breaks after class, we'd spend hours talking, mostly about Hunter S. Thompson and Kurt Vonnegut, and when I told him I wanted to write, he was the first person in my life to say, "Do it." After Dan perished, his body was never found. I thought for a while that I wanted to be an anthropologist like him, but to switch over to a major in anthropology, I first had to sign up for a course called Social Science Research Methods. The professor, a young guy with a beard and long brown hair like mine down his back, seemed like a creative type, inspiring and funny in his own way, until I stopped him midway through the lecture in our second class. "Okay, wait a minute," I said. "What you're saying here is it's our job as social scientists to turn people into numbers and add those numbers up, and that's the truth?" "Well, that's a bit oversimplified," he said, "but sort of." "Thanks," I said, and stood from my desk. "I think I'll stick with lit. I think I may just write." I dropped the class right away to become an English major. I was a bit of a smart-ass back then, and I guess I still am. I suppose I still believe literature can say more about human nature than statistics. I'm just saying, I could be wrong. In addition to Gabrielle Rico's application of brain science to writing, she's probably best known for her brainstorming technique known as clustering, a method in which we write down words and make associations like answers to a Rorschach test. Rico tends in her book to use intuitive and visual right brain associations and connections using abstract concepts rather than from concrete images or scenes. But I remember reading her book during an artist residency at Villa Montalvo in California and writing better, more effortlessly than I had in years, because I clustered and drew all my stories. Visual storytelling helped me in ways I'm still benefiting from, and I find more and more that I have to see a story's shape before I can decide where to begin and where to go after that. Usually I write all over the place, and in some ways that's exactly what I'm advocating here, is just another way of seeing your own writing process and product. Now, 30 years after writing the natural way, many software code engineers and designers have written countless programs to emulate the clustering process on a computer, universally known these days as mind maps. These programs, along with writing software such as Literature and Latte's Scrivener, have made balancing, generating, and sequencing mind much easier than writing a novel, say, in Microsoft Word or some other standard word processing program, giving us the ability to look at the micro and the macro levels of our books simultaneously, so we can begin to answer the most basic time-bound questions storytellers ask as they write and structure their books. What happens and when, and what kind of book am I writing? A traditional linear narrative or something completely different? Of course, visual storytelling is nothing new, really. Early writing was often made up of storytelling pictograms by the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, Native American tribes, and so on. The writing was on the wall for Babylon's ruler Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, for example. Beware your doom. And in a more modern example, when his novel The Fable became too complex even for him to see and understand, the writing was on the wall for William Faulkner too. An outline he drew over his writing desk in his home Roanoke in Oxford, Mississippi. I've seen it when I went there to visit, and it's really quite remarkable. The double-brain task of generating material, ideas, images, metaphors, scenes, sequences, stories, and chapters, then bringing them all together and organizing them into a coherent, organic structure has always been a problem for writers, especially writers working on long book projects. I've struggled with the task for years in much the same way I've seen my writing students and thesis advisees struggle. Recently, a student told me after class that she'd written notes for the novel she wanted to write in 100 different composition notebooks scattered across her bedroom. She'd fill them all up, she told me, and smiled. Wow, I said, that's pretty cool. Then I remembered the scene in Seven when Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt's characters find hundreds of notebooks of ranting gibberish stacked in no particular order in the apartment of the Seven Deadly Sins serial killer character, Kevin Spacey. It was hard to tell if the killer was crazy while he wrote or if he was crazy because he had written in the notebooks and couldn't find what he needed when he needed it. Good luck with that, I told the student. Thinking of how to sift through all that material made my brain hurt. When I first started writing, and still sometimes when I get ideas and don't have anything to write on, I'd write on the backs of envelopes and letters and bills and cereal boxes and toilet paper, throwing everything into a cardboard box to sift through later. Not particularly efficient. For a while, because it's what I was supposed to do when I worked on a screenplay, I kept 3x5 cards in my back pocket. I wrote in many personal writing journals over many years too, but because I was terrified of organizing or making sense of all that material, just trying to decide what to keep and what to throw out, I mostly just wrote blindly with almost no plan at all. That didn't go so well even when I was just writing short stories. Now, every time I have an idea for a scene or a line of dialogue, I write it or say it into my iPhone and save it in Evernote, which syncs the note across all my computers. When I've accumulated too many notes to keep up with, then I put them all into a mind map that I sync on Dropbox, and I figure out where to put those ideas wherever they happen to stick. And what I've noticed most is that organizing material gives me almost as many new ideas and simply generating it, spilling words onto whatever paper I can find when an idea comes. If I don't write the ideas down, of course, whether I end up using them or not, I'll forget them forever. And most of my better ideas come when I'm not writing at all. What's changed in the last 30 or 40 years since I first started writing has had mostly to do with the almost geometric growth of and improvements in computers and computer software. And while on some levels I suppose I am a bit of a troglodyte, I write mostly traditional realistic stories, for example, I've never been that way with technology. And I've tried to use every new improvement I can find to help me write the way that feels most comfortable and right to me. What works for me probably won't work for you, but maybe some of the techniques I'm suggesting here might help you if you try them out. Take what you can use in this presentation and toss the rest. Free advice which you're free to ignore. If all the technical talk seems a bit intimidating, I'll do my best to explain shortcuts so the learning curve isn't quite so steep. Some writers laugh when they see how I write. I have 3 different computer screens I move among when I'm writing, for example, something similar to the huge set of drums I've been playing since I was a kid. And writers tell me, man, I never plan ahead. I just drink me a 6-pack or a bottle of wine or smoke me a doobie and go with it. Or, dude, you're so freaking anal. Or, hey, no decent writer ever outlines a novel, dude. That's crazy. Takes away all the magic, the duende. You know, I'm not sure if I disagree with any of this. I just want to have an idea about where I'm going without setting my path in concrete. If there's technology that'll help me make it a little easier for me to do that, why not take advantage of this huge leap in human evolution? What I've noticed is that being able to use programs like the free Evernote, mind maps, and a writing program like Scrivener, I don't run into the same blocks I did almost every day for years. And I can switch effortlessly between generating mine and sequencing mine whenever I need to, without the kind of internal conflict and confusion I had most of the time. Free programs like Evernote, free or inexpensive mind mapping programs like MindMap or FreeMind, and inexpensive yet sophisticated writing programs like Scrivener help us put all those messy notes in one place, like a giant file cabinet that we can access almost immediately. All our notes and files at once, moving back and forth between parts and the whole, and being able to make increasingly great sense of both. In many ways, moving from old to new methods of generating and organizing material is a bit like the difference between using a card catalog in the old libraries and using Boolean keywords to search databases on a supercomputer. In a real sense, any information we need is accessible now by simply Googling it. Strange how that's become a verb. Rather than having to deal with no roadmap, or a paper roadmap, and detours, and roadblocks, and getting lost when we all have to do is get out the GPS and wait for it to say, rerouting. It may seem like a cop-out, a crutch, whatever, to rely on these technologies, but I don't care. I'm working more now with greater ease than I ever have. I don't think about jumping out of windows from high buildings quite so often. Before I tell a story about real maps and mind mapping to illustrate how software has transformed my writing of book-length projects, let's take a look at the mind mapping and word processing software I'm recommending for this class, MindMap and Scrivener. After a great deal of research and trying out mind mapping programs over the last few years, I'm going to recommend that everyone in the class who can afford it buy ConceptDraw's MindMap. I'll discuss others in a moment, but I've listed the web addresses here and in our syllabus so you may buy the program at a discounted education price, $25. Much less expensive than the regular price, around $200. This program has many advantages over other mind mapping programs I've researched and work with. First, it's remarkably sophisticated and ridiculously cheap, at least for teachers and students. Second, it has a brainstorming mode that suits generating mind nicely, giving you the chance to spill out as many images, ideas, and dramatic scenes as you can before you organize them in sequencing mind. Third, and perhaps most important, the program exports to outline markup or OPML files, which you can then import into Scrivener, the best software I can think of using when writing and organizing a book-length narrative. The interaction between both programs makes generating, sequencing, and organizing your book, especially early in a project, much easier to deal with than ordinary counterintuitive word processing programs like Microsoft Word. And they both remain flexible and fairly easy to switch between, generating and sequencing, generating and resequencing, cutting and changing and moving and starting over if the need arises, until you know what you have to write now in this moment, driven by passion and unstuck from time and linear storytelling. In Mind Map's brainstorming mode, you're given 10 minutes to spill out as many ideas as you can. Generating mind freed from sequencing mind until it has to do its job in its own time. You can map out characterization, place, setting, significant images and details, almost any idea, theme, or abstraction that comes to you. But ultimately, once these maps have brought your story into focus for you, you need to focus mostly on the story itself, the drama of the story, on what happens, what characters do and say, what conflicts they're in with other characters, and so on. Scenic development one after another, but out of linear order. Starting with the first scene you know you have to write, then the next, and the next. This is an important point. If you try to map out abstractions, you'll be left with abstractions. But if you imagine images, characters, and conflict that embody those abstractions and write dramatic scenes and snippets of narrative and dialogue, your story will be much more concrete and easier to build upon and sequence later. Remember, your job for now is simply to tell the story. Essentially, when we face the question, where do I begin, we don't have to type a page and wad it up and throw it into the trash anymore, and then type another page. But we can discover where to begin without the limits of worrying where the story's chronology really ends and begins, and how all the stories fit together in linear time or some other modular structure we have yet to discover. Instead of being in conflict, generating mind and sequencing mind find the balance they need to perform their roles when they're needed, making the best use of both logic and imagination, creating intuitive leaps that create others, then creating a tentative order out of the chaos of events in a book made up of many stories, whether they're short stories or episodic chapters in a novel. While I often use Concept Draw's mind map, especially to brainstorm early writing I need to discover and develop before I write, I also use the timeline feature in another mind mapping program, Matchware's MindView. Even though this program is more expensive than most mind mapping programs, I use it not just to map out ideas, scenes, and stories, or chapters, but also to help me create complex timelines for the narratives I'm writing. Even though you can export OPML files directly from MindView, I've copied and pasted them into MindMap and then exported them from there. The timeline feature itself makes the price, about $69 for an education license, worth it. And if you think that timelines could help you in a complex, time-bound narrative, and if you can afford the program, you can email David Hamilton at usa@matchware.com, matchware.com, and he'll send you a link to buy the program at the education price. This offer is for my students only. Please attach a copy of your student ID or a copy of your recent tuition payment in the email as evidence of your student status. I've been working with David for several years now, and he's been remarkably generous in helping me get a discount for my students. The regular price for a single user license, $279 for the Windows version and $249 for the Mac version, make the discount significant, even if it's a bit pricey just to be able to create timelines. If you want to see the full gamut of mind mapping software out there, especially freeware, Wikipedia is a good place to start. I've tried a few of these programs, and though I have my preferences, many of the programs might have features that better suit your writing process or visual preferences. Of course, you don't have to use the mind mapping software I'm recommending, or for that matter, any mind mapping software at all. If all this strikes you as too much geeky brain work that seems way too complicated, distracting, and divorced from how you write, then by all means, at any point you'd like, toss what's not working for you and move on. Onto a path to discovering your own distinctive writing process in your own way. But for now, I'm suggesting that you try it out. I wish I'd had mind maps for my critical papers years ago. They would have made my writing much easier, and certainly they would have helped me much more with my fiction. The most sophisticated of the free programs listed in Wikipedia is FreeMind, an open source program designed for public use. The main disadvantages of the program are that it's written in Java, a code that in recent years has been vulnerable to cyber attacks and viruses. And it doesn't export OPML files that you can import into Scrivener. But what the hey, it's feature rich and free. Another newly released mind mapping program not listed in Wikipedia, at least at this point, Scapple, is designed by Literature and Latte, the same company that produces Scrivener. The program's remarkably inexpensive, $12 for an education license, and it integrates well with Scrivener. It exports to OPML files, and unlike any mind mapping program I know of, it allows more than one connection between many ideas, stories, and scenes, rather than depending on simple coordination and subordination, making the program more flexible and spontaneous than others, like freehand clustering on paper. Another simple cross-platform mind mapping program I also admire is MindNode, which integrates maps on Macs, iPhones, and iPads and exports to OPML files you can import into Scrivener. But as of now, the program doesn't yet work on Windows PCs, tablets, or phones. I've used many word processing programs going all the way back to the mid-1980s. WordStar for my old K-Pro computer, which had real floppy disks that held no more than 128 kilobytes. Yes, I'm that old. AmiPro and WordPro for my first Windows PC, and of course Microsoft Word and Apple's Pages for my Mac Pro. With each of these programs, I've tried to find ways of simplifying the writing of books. Pages has a thumbnail view, and it's fairly easy to move into sequencing mind despite other limitations. Earlier versions of Word were incredibly complicated when it came to juggling separate documents, and even though the latest versions of Word have a thumbnail and outline pane, it's still a huge pain to move quickly and easily from generating to sequencing mind and back. After over 30 years of using writing programs that just plain sucked when it came to writing a book, I've started using Scrivener, a program that's affordable between $35 and $40 for an education license. And it makes moving from generating mind to sequencing mind so simple and reflexive that it's a wonder no one's come up with such a program before now. Of course, it took a writer who was also a programmer to figure it out. Simply put, Scrivener makes it possible to see both the forest and the trees, the parts and the whole, the chapters or stories, and the entire book simultaneously, giving fiction writers the ability to experiment with many possible shapes and structures as they write. Though the entire program has a fairly steep learning curve at first, it puts the emphasis mostly on switching between generating and sequencing mind, and it saves issues of formatting and printing and saving for the end of the writing process, giving writers the opportunity to compile their books in different formats such as rich text format compatible with Word and other word processing programs such as Adobe PDF, ebook, and other standard formats. The main focus, writing and organizing, makes it fairly easy to get to work right away, allowing writers to dig into other features when they have time. This course isn't designed to show you how to use Scrivener, but you can train yourself reading and studying the many available how-to books and viewing the many available tutorials online, both on the Literature and Latte site and on YouTube, and there are many of them. The real beauty of the program is that you can write freely, experimenting with, but not necessarily having to commit to any particular structure or product, only to the process itself. Everything is exploration. If what you're doing isn't working, it allows you to try something else until you know more about how you write and what you're writing, taking as a given that you won't know what your book will look like until you've written the last draft. The program also makes backing up the many drafts of your files easy by using snapshots and auto backups to make sure that you don't lose all the work you've had for over days, weeks, months, and years. I use the program with Dropbox, which syncs each new draft across all my computers, just as it will the workshop documents we'll be discussing in this class. Before I begin discussing how I use the software I'm recommending for this class, I'd like first to talk a bit about map making and the evolution of actual maps, and then tell a story about a journey I went on to find a real map that illustrates how I use evolving mind maps and Scrivener documents together in book projects I'm working on. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by old maps, especially those early maps of monsters rising up out of the sea and the just barely recognizable outlines of continents, imprecisely defined until centuries later in contemporary maps and smartphones with GPS. Where explorers hadn't yet explored, they imagined the gaps in the maps of the unknown new world, projecting their fears, hopes, and dreams in startling images that still reflect a kind of first and second and third and fourth draft of a new world still hidden in places from us even today. In many respects, these maps reflect snapshots of a world barely known, a story barely understood, maps that have evolved over centuries, the same kind of evolving maps that can help us delineate the long narratives of the literary journeys we want to set out on. To tell the beginning, from the beginning to middle to end, and not necessarily in that order. Each draft of each map reflecting a new discovery within ourselves and our stories, changing as our stories deepen. More of the stories visible and perhaps a little less frightening, or perhaps much more, as we visit the monsters of our imaginations, finding those stories in an organic way rather than trying to impose a map upon the reality of those stories. A map based not so much on plot, than something deeper, something that doesn't quite reflect what we mean or want to mean quite yet, something still hidden from us. Each map, changed by the countless numbers of explorers charting the waters and the land of the New World, became more definitive. The shorelines less straight and more chaotic. Not the worlds themselves, but representations of those worlds. And perhaps more important, a record of the journeys themselves. Each new explorer striking out across the terrible seas and redrawing the map with the knowledge of their new discoveries. Rather than outlining books, I think we must first begin with and discover our obsessions. The great beasts of the seas like the white whale and Moby Dick, to explore the unseen and the unknown, and then to allow them to unfold like old maps of a new world we're just beginning to understand. A world we're creating as we travel through it. Mind maps can evolve as we instinctively find new material, new ideas, new images, and dramatic scenes based upon unconscious projections, hunches, ideas, and other things not fully yet in focus. They can help us face the underlying terror of the blank page and the wide expanse of our uncharted sea we must cross. Where do we depart, we ask. Then where do we go? And where are we when we have arrived? Native Americans were called Indians based upon a misunderstanding that the first explorers thought they'd landed not in the Americas but in India. Unstuck from linear time and a still unknown and still unmapped space, these mind maps give us a way to organize new worlds as we discover what they are always on the alert and watching the horizon, shouting out from the crow's nest, "Beware, there be monsters this way." Maps. Recently I've been working on a story, Six Flags Over My Father, part of a novel and stories I've been working on for about 10 years. The story's lain dormant, insisted in my brain for over 50 years, and it began from an actual map I spent all last summer, the summer of 2012, trying to find. And a first line that I'm not sure will be the first line when the story's finished. The morning my father finally kept his promise to take us kids to Six Flags over Texas, he dropped a 100-pound flagstone onto his foot. The story, set in 1965, just months after the narrator's brother bleeds to death, is just now coming into focus for me. But first I had to find an old park map of Six Flags Over Texas and create my own mind map to help me stumble ahead, like the half-drunk father in the story, stopping at the rides along the way, imagining what happens and then what happens next. I have something of a built-in organization and structure for the story now, a cobbled-together series of digital photos of an actual 1965 park map that an expert on the history of Six Flags was kind enough to send me after I finally tracked him down. Like the actual park map my father used to guide my family when, like the narrator in the story, I was 10 and my brother had just died of blood cancer, an unconscious map of a story I'm only beginning to discover came into focus, its barest outlines being this. A father at the peak of his career loses his youngest son and his dream house and his architectural practice. And then the father, who's just broken most of the toes in one foot, decides to keep his promise anyway, to take his remaining children and wife on a long, limping walk during a hot July day through Six Flags Over Texas. In increasing unspeakable pain, he loses each family member scattered across the park, and then loses his map and becomes lost himself as he tries to walk through the maze of park rides and food stands in the huge parking lot looking for his car. His only medication, a bottle of aspirin, and a couple of flasks of Old Crow in his pocket. As of now, I've written about 10 pages of this story, but that's about all I know and all I'm going to tell you. Fact is, I don't know the rest, and I don't want to know until I get there. The joy is in the not knowing. Besides, as Janet Burroway writes, telling a story before we've written it is like blowing a huge pink bubble of double bubble gum, only to have it pop and then stick to our faces, unfinished and a big mess. I'm just giving you the barest outlines of a map for a story that's yet to be finished, a still undiscovered world, and I am using a real map and a mind map to tell the story. After months of searching, when I finally found an expert about the park with the rare map I'd spent most of the spring and summer looking for, a long journey I'd taken like the father looking for his lost family. When I finally talked to the man on the phone, he said yes, in fact, he did have a 1965 park map of Six Flags Over Texas, in mint condition, hanging from his dining room wall. Apparently, he'd spent a lot of money and years trying to find it, too. He got it on eBay. I told him about the story I'm working on, and he agreed to help, taking about 30 photos of the map on his wall in pieces, and then emailing them to me. And I assembled them together like a fall-apart map found in the catacombs of Paris. As the map came into focus, I remembered each of the now disappeared park rides. They're all gone now. I'd ridden on as a kid, especially the Spelunkers Cave, where I knew the most important scene would take place. A 10-year-old kid riding lost and alone in a floating tub through a world lit by black lights and glowing rat-nosed spelunkers, painted in fluorescent paint, who stood guard over their gold booty, playing old songs of the sea on their squeeze boxes. Before I could even begin the story, though, I had to plan out the actual route of the story itself, which had only a limited number of possibilities, entering the park from either the east or the west. Moving from the fluidity of randomly spilled images and scenes, now becoming stuck in linear time and in space that no longer exist. The park map itself anchored to all the landmarks and souvenirs I still barely remembered: the tilted floor of the Casa Magnetica, the spray on my face and the dive and splash of the log flume, the rebel's cap and the pirate's sword I'd badgered my father to buy, and something called a pink thing, a somewhat phallic pink ice cream bar that tasted like frozen mushy bubblegum that might pop in one's face at any moment. When I had an actual copy of the 1965 park map, the expert who'd been so generous to photograph it for me also helped me to remember each section of the park in detail: Spain, France, Mexico, Texas, the Confederacy, and the United States, so that I could have a full sense of place. The heat, the blue-dyed muddy water, stagnant with water-walking bugs and the squirming larvae of mosquitoes, cotton seeds floating in the air like snow, the impossible heat and humidity, the names of the strange rides that now seem so cheesy and wonderfully campy to me now. The place is gone, lost like the characters who become lost in it, and my memory of the park at that particular time in its history in my life, now recounted in my imagination, returned to me like a fever dream. Such is the work of research and mind mapping. Without the real map and my growing, evolving mind map, I would never have been able to transport myself to that world and transport others there with me. Of course, the small map of the story grew separately from a much larger map of a book in progress containing many stories. But it began first as a few kernels of memory and felt experience I jotted down, and an early version of the book's larger mind map. In fact, all I'd started with was a small note in a big Scrivener binder file filled with stories. Most of them I'd already written and published. And in that group, a story I still wanted to write labeled Father, Flagstone, Family, Six Flags. I don't know why I wanted to write the story when I started it. I just had the vague obsession and a few images in the barest outlines of a story. The story of a man who drops a stone on his foot and decides finally to keep his promise, even though he's in terrible pain. And the story of a lost boy in a park ride, alone, trying to remember the face of his dead brother, trying to bring him back to life in his imagination so his brother can see something he had always wanted to see but never lived long enough to. I just knew that I had to write the story, some deep obsession that I couldn't name, but I knew I had to follow and explore. The kind of obsession that's led me to other stories I've been writing. And the more I mapped the story and researched the park itself, the more the main scenes took shape, especially the most important dramatic scene, which took place on a map trapped in time and a particular route along that map. I'm still writing the story now, and I have no idea what will happen next, only the map and the mind map and the unconscious burning toward discovery and recognition. As in the journey of writing E.L. Doctorow describes, I'm still trapped in the fog with only my headlights and a rough evolving map that helps me find my way, even if I end up taking a detour I haven't quite imagined yet. Besides, I have a crappy car, and I'm still a little afraid of getting stuck along an abandoned highway at night, and, like a lot of men who don't want to ask for directions, I get lost so easily, so it's always helpful to have a map. The map has become the journey itself, merging into a story I'm free to discover as landmarks pass, and all I have to do is drive. Looks a bit terrifying, doesn't it? But this map of my book in progress has helped me tremendously. The book itself has grown a history of its own and an evolving map coming into focus, a long genealogy in fact, first as a mind map that I drew on particle board over 20 years ago, then as a digital mind map, then as an outline. Then as an actual timeline that I could refer to when I began to become so unstuck in time that I needed an accurate reference point for birth dates and death dates and significant historical and dramatic events in the story. Rather than asking myself, okay, so how old is the narrator in 1965? All I had to do was take a look at the timeline to make sure I got the details and linear and historical time-bound facts and dates right. And as those time-bound facts and dates accumulated, the story began to appear and fit into a timeline. Significant moments in the story itself with 100 years and more of backstory about dead grandfathers and violent great-grandfathers and lost sons and dead brothers and violent fathers at the beginning of the nuclear age. The truly wonderful thing about using a mind mapping program with a word processing program like Scrivener is that you can export mind maps, simple or complex, from them into OPML files. Then import those outline files into Scrivener and then use them as starting points for your writing projects, long or short. Any writing task that you must begin from scratch, the blaring white page or computer screen that you need to see first to discover what to write and tentatively organize as you go. Of course, if you decide to add or expand sections as you write, no problem. You can even take what you've written in Scrivener, export it into another OPML file, and then re-import it back into the mind map, just to help you reorganize the structure again, if you need to, and you probably will. The truly wonderful thing about Scrivener is that it's possible to see both the whole book in the binder and its parts simultaneously, always writing the obsessions that burn in our bellies out of order if we wish. And when we get stuck, move on to others, reorganizing or reimagining our stories and their possible structures in countless thought experiments, abandoning or moving outmoded maps, using our word processors rather than having them use us. And having the maps, we can go for long stretches of writing mostly linear scenes as they compel us to write them, then and only then, freed from linear time and space. And if we want to organize everything into traditional linear order, we can. I do that a lot. Or we can just shuffle the pages as Cortázar did in his experimental novel Hopscotch, as novelists like Faulkner did in A Fable and The Sound and Fury, and screenwriters like Charlie Kaufman and Quentin Tarantino did in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or Pulp Fiction. We're free to take our journeys in whatever ways we wish without having to get too far lost, or without necessarily losing our readers, our fellow travelers along the way. And in many ways, this process reflects the incredible transition from analog to digital thinking over the last 50 years. Record players stuck in their grooves and cassette tapes stuck on a long, winding magnetic ribbon shifting to non-linear CDs and DVDs and hard drives and now solid-state drives that can store information in a linear or non-linear way. We writers live in a remarkable time with technology breakthroughs that best mirror our complex minds as they explore their deepest obsessions. In this presentation slide, which I put together almost a month ago, long before I actually wrote this presentation, I cluster in generating mind, organize in sequencing mind, then export my map into an OPML file that I then import directly into Scrivener. Notice how the imported outline is built into Scrivener in a fairly coherent order with headings that you can use for topics or scenes or chapters. When I first began writing Six Flags Over My Father, I found myself writing a lot of backstory that I couldn't decide how to use without interrupting the flow of the present action. So I began to reorganize those long paragraphs of backstory by weaving them tightly into short snippets of the present action, moving from time-bound linear order to a more modular structure, something like a layer cake, a basic structure I'll discuss in Part 3. As I write this presentation now, I can see that the presentation itself has already changed significantly since I started putting it together. And I know instinctively that this sequencing mind decision may not be the way I finally organize the story or the presentation I'm still working on. Being able to shift back and forth between generating ideas and organizing them now seems almost effortless. Sorry, Microsoft, but I'm never going back to Word for anything but memos and letters, and good riddance. To simplify what I'm sure must by now seem to be a completely insane, confusing, or overly complex writing system, I'm going to ask you to follow 6 fairly straightforward steps at the beginning of this semester that I hope will save you countless hours of confusion and writer's block as you write the books you want to write in your long distinguished careers. I've been using this method for several years now with my thesis students, and I think it's helped them. I know it's helped me. But it may not help everyone, and that's a given. Free advice you're free to ignore. Once you figure out the steps, you'll find a great deal more freedom when you're writing your book-length projects. At least, that's my hope. First, in Concept Draw's mind map, or any mind mapping program that can export to OPML files, spill out as many ideas, images, characters, scenes, and chapters of the book you want to work on now as you can. One idea making you think intuitively of another, and so on, through association. For your thesis or not, for now or later in your MFA program, wherever you are and want to be. If you don't want to write an entire book project now, but want to learn your craft a bit more before you begin working on such a long book project, no problem. Start with 2 short stories, if you'd like, or several short stories or vignettes if you're afraid of committing to a project you don't quite have clearly in your mind. All I'm asking you to do is to make and revise 2 mind maps, to write and revise 2 book summaries, 2 book proposals for a potential book project we'll workshop during the semester. Mostly I'm suggesting ways for you to continue working on after this class, to return to later, or to abandon altogether. Just don't throw away any of what you've written so far. You can always return to it later. And when it's time to workshop the mind maps, focus primarily on writing dramatic scenes. 2. Once you've spilled out all the countless scenes you want to write and all the obligatory scenes you know you have to write, those moments when the greatest conflicts, changes, and complete reversals in character or reader expectations take place. Then and only then, when your mind is exhausted and empty and the page is full, a mess of ideas, begin moving all these randomly generated fragments into a coherent order. 1 or more alternating structures if you'd like, linear, chronological, or some other modular structure that's just now coming into focus for you. I'll be discussing some of those tentative basic structures in part 3 of this presentation. These are simple explorations, and none of the maps you create are in any way permanent. Like this class, they're simply thought experiments, bones from which to hang the meat, heart, and brains of your stories for now. Keep in mind that while it's possible to organize a novel like an argument rhetorically, topically, most novels aren't organized that way. Sometimes they're organized by date or place or both. Sometimes by the speakers or points of view characters. And you don't know which one works organically for your project until you've experimented with the structure, something you won't really make final decisions about until you've written a complete draft or 2 of your book. The map you're creating now may bear no resemblance at all to the book you'll write in the end. So the map's really just for you, the writer, not the reader. Perhaps the best way to begin is to organize every dramatic scene in a rough linear order that you may or may not use in your final draft. This timeline, like your mind map, is mostly for you and not for your reader. The point in many ways is to discover a timeline without being tied to it. 3. When you're satisfied with having emptied your mind of story ideas and scenes, when you've satisfied your tentative organization in all its possible permutations, export your mind map into an OPML file. 4. Open a blank document in Scrivener. I recommend using one of Scrivener's fiction templates as the best place to start. Even if I'm working on a book of stories, I tend to begin with the novel template, so check it out. 5. Import the OPML file you saved from your mind map into Scrivener so that you can see all your ideas in headings from which you can begin writing. These headings should show up at the top of individual documents and in the binder on the left, where you can move them around as much as you'd like. 6. Then if you've already written many or even just a few stories or chapters of this tentative book project, and if you've already written notes and gathered research, begin copying over everything into this one Scrivener file. Usually, if you have, say, several Word documents, you can simply drag them from the directories scattered across your computer so that you'll have everything you need in one place. Or you can import them directly into Scrivener. Either way works fine. Scrivener is remarkably flexible, and it imports everything from important web pages and documents to media files or digital images scanned from old family files. So if you need to refer to research in almost any format or form, it should be right there for you to click on. One cool feature of Scrivener is something called scrivenings. First, you can insert a single non-standard character, like a number sign or asterisk, to break up single documents in Word, chapters or stories you've already written, so that if you want to reorganize those scenes and sections within the single documents, you can, experimenting with the structure of single documents in the same way you can with multiple documents. Then, in the binder, you may select all those scenes or sections so you can see them all on one page and revise them with transitions if you need them. I found this feature particularly helpful when trying to weave scene and summary, backstory, exposition, and isolated moments or passages of dialogue, or even narrative within dramatic scenes, with a kind of ease and freedom that's simply unavailable or too time-consuming to use in a standard word processing program. If you type these non-standard characters into old world Word documents where you want to separate scenes, for example, you can use the Import with Breaks feature in Scrivener, so that it automatically makes the breaks for you and you can restructure stories or chapters without having to spend hours cutting and pasting. Finally, once you have everything you can find that might help you to begin your book, start where you have to start, not necessarily at the beginning, and let the fire in your belly, your most brightly burning obsession, lead you through passion rather than the sometimes crippling requirements of writing in linear order. That's about it for now. In part 3 of this presentation, I'll discuss a few basics about conflict and a few basics of structure in the novel, the book of short stories and the novel in stories, just to get you started thinking about how to sequence your stories, scenes and ideas and stories in your mind maps and Scrivener.